It was a warm spring afternoon at JFK International Airport. Passengers were boarding a flight to Los Angeles, and among them was Elaine Thomas, a poised black woman in her 30s. She carried a small tote bag and a book titled Overcoming Adversity. Elaine was a professor of social justice, and this trip was for a major conference where she was a keynote speaker. Elaine found her seat in first class, a perk she had saved up for. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment and settled into her seat by the window. The cabin buzzed with activity as other passengers boarded. Elaine took a deep breath, excited but slightly nervous about her speech. Her thoughts were interrupted when the flight's head flight attendant, Mr. Bradley, approached her row. Bradley, a tall, white man in his mid-40s, with a clipped tone, glanced at Elaine and frowned. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said curtly. "I think you might be in the wrong seat. This is first class." Elaine looked up, surprised. "This is my seat," she replied calmly, showing her boarding pass. Bradley barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "Let me double-check with the manifest," he muttered, walking away briskly. Elaine felt a knot form in her stomach as other passengers looked at her. A middle-aged woman across the aisle offered a sympathetic smile, but most just stared silently. Bradley returned a moment later, his expression unchanged. "It seems there's been a mistake," he said coldly. "Economy is at the back of the plane." Elaine took a deep breath to steady herself. "There's no mistake. I paid for this seat," she said firmly, handing him her boarding pass again. Bradley sighed loudly, glancing at the growing line of passengers behind them. "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult," he said, his voice dripping with irritation. The tension in the cabin grew. A man in the row ahead turned around and said, "Just let her sit. She's clearly in the right seat." Bradley shot him a sharp look. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." Another passenger, a young Latina woman, chimed in. "Why are you targeting her? She's done nothing wrong." Bradley ignored her, leaning closer to Elaine. "Ma'am, if you don't comply, I'll have to call security." Elaine's heart raced, but she refused to be intimidated. "Please do," she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside. "I've done nothing wrong." Bradley stepped away, pulling out his radio. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A little boy whispered to his mother, "Why is that man being mean to her?" The mother hushed him, looking embarrassed. As Bradley radioed for assistance, the co-pilot, Mark Davis, happened to walk through the cabin, checking on passengers. Mark was a white man in his 50s, with a kind demeanor. He noticed the commotion and stopped by Elaine's row. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Bradley turned to Mark, gesturing toward Elaine. "This passenger is in the wrong seat and refuses to move." Mark looked at Elaine, who held up her boarding pass. "I'm in the right seat," she said, her voice steady. Mark took the boarding pass, examined it, and nodded. "She's exactly where she's supposed to be," he said, handing it back to her. Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but Mark raised a hand. "I'll handle it from here." Mark crouched slightly to meet Elaine's gaze. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, ma'am. Please make yourself comfortable," he said warmly. Elaine nodded, grateful but still shaken. Mark turned to Bradley, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk." Bradley followed Mark to the galley, where their conversation became heated. Passengers in the nearby rows strained to listen. "Why are you making an issue where there isn't one?" Mark demanded. Bradley's face reddened. "I thought she was in the wrong seat." "You thought? Or you assumed?" Mark shot back. "This isn't the first time, Bradley. You've had complaints before." Meanwhile, in first class, the murmurs continued. Elaine tried to focus on her book, but her hands trembled slightly. The Latina woman leaned over. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Elaine nodded, forcing a smile. "Thank you for speaking up." The flight's captain, James Carter, entered the cabin. James, a tall black man in his early 40s, had been briefed about the incident by Mark. He walked directly to Elaine's row, his presence commanding attention. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, with a reassuring smile. "I'm Captain Carter. I want to personally apologize for what happened." Elaine looked up, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she said softly. Captain Carter turned to address the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment before we take off. What happened here today was unacceptable. This airline does not tolerate discrimination of any kind." The cabin fell silent. Captain Carter continued, "We are committed to ensuring every passenger feels respected and valued. If any of you ever witness behavior that doesn't align with these values, I encourage you to speak up." The passengers broke into applause. Bradley, standing in the galley, looked down, his face pale. Captain Carter approached him. "Meet me in my office after this flight," he said curtly, before returning to the cockpit. The flight proceeded smoothly, but the atmosphere had shifted. Passengers went out of their way to be kind to Elaine, offering smiles and small talk. She felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Upon landing, Elaine was approached by an airline representative. "Ms. Thomas, we deeply regret what you experienced today. As a gesture of our apology, we'd like to offer you a year of free flights with us." Elaine was taken aback. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "But what I really hope is that this never happens to anyone else." A few weeks later, Elaine received an email from Captain Carter. He shared that Bradley had been reassigned to a non-customer-facing role, and that the airline was implementing new training to address implicit bias. Elaine's story went viral, sparking a broader conversation about racism and accountability. She received messages of support from around the world, many praising her courage and Captain Carter's leadership. The video ends with a montage of passengers boarding flights, smiling and helping one another, accompanied by the words, "Change begins with courage. Together, we can create a more inclusive world." Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories.